was a supernumerary minister in the Durham and DNS Valley Circuit and a minister of wide experience. And I'm particularly delighted to speak to Paul because Paul was one of the report writers of Hope in God's Future, a report that was written in 2009 and brought to the Methodist Conference. We're going to hear this morning a little bit about that report and a little bit about where we are now in terms of issues of climate change. Paul, thank you first of all for being willing to share with us this morning. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your background and how you became interested in issues of climate change.
Well, I think I've, as long as I can remember, been interested in the environment. I was brought up near Morecambe Bay, literally 100 yards from Morecambe Bay, a place called Preesall, if anybody knows that area. And, you know, we used to put out lines for fish and so on. And my friends all were children of farmers. And I do remember that we couldn't fish any longer because the lugworms had all been poisoned by ICI with mercury. So moving to Birmingham at 14, that became biology for me. And I remember in the sixth form walking out of Latin, English and history and doing biology, physics and chemistry. I wanted to know how wood worked. I wanted to understand it. I wanted to know how the systems functioned, which led me to London University for my first degree, Royal Holloway, which was in botany and zoology. And I got fascinated by lichens there. I was very lucky to be awarded a studentship at Aberystwyth, one of the very few on lichens. And I spent a very happy 3 years studying lichens, but in relation to sulfur dioxide pollution. So I did the actual field trials of sulfur dioxide and lichens there. I gave some international papers and got invited to Germany and measured their air pollution, Düsseldorf and Cologne. So in a sense, I've had a history. I was invited by the West German government to the European meeting on acid rain, which the British government boycotted. And I was one of the key speakers at it. So I was very early in air pollution studies, which meant when I was on Faith and Order, and we were asked for somebody to be involved in this report, in a sense that was an obvious one for me to be involved in. So climate change has been interesting because to me it's a talisman for a whole lot more stuff, which has always been there. You know, we've known that carbon dioxide would have this effect. It's come to the fore probably in the last 10 years, although we've known for 100 years. But the effects, we've been able to go backwards in data, like the ice cores, and we can see its effects now. It's doing what we would expect it to do.
I mean, Hope in God's Future was a highly significant report in the life of the Methodist Church. And of course, because it came from the Joint Public Issues team, it also had an impact on the United Reformed Church and the Baptist Church at that point. I mean, I wonder if you could just explain to us some of the main themes in the report.
I think so. I mean, it begins with creation theology, which is our relationship with the rest of creation, which is vital. And you know, the value of God's creation, our responsibilities towards it, the inherent value, not just whether it's useful, but it has its own value because it is loved by God. It doesn't mean it's unchanging and unchangeable. It's dynamic. It always will be, and we are bound to have effects on it. Then the other themes which come from this are our love for our neighbours and our responsibility to those who share the planet with us, wherever they are, and those who come after us, so looking to succeeding generations as well. And then another very strong issue is that of justice, which relates obviously to what I've just said, but I think it's not simply about reducing carbon footprints, but it's about acting justly to those who are suffering, because pollution almost always is actually produced by those who are wealthier and more powerful, and is suffered by those who are poorer and less powerful. And that's very true of the world at the moment. So the worldwide responsibilities we have.
Thanks,
I think hope is important as well. There's a danger with this of simply saying we can't do it, it's too big, what can we do? And that's why it has the title it has. The report actually is in the form, in many ways, of A communion service, if you look at it, as you go through it, it's liturgical, as well as a report on science and theology. So you can actually move through it and see the structure of a service in it.
I mean, I hope people will pick up on that and use that as an opportunity for constructing worship. That would be great. But I mean, it's now, I mean, just over 10 years since the report was published. And I wonder if you've any reflections on how things have changed since then. I mean, both positively and negatively, and the kinds of challenges that we face now.
I think attitudes have changed dramatically. When it was produced, in many ways, some of the reaction was hostile. There wasn't a lot of reaction, but the reaction we did get was hostile, and I met some of that. But I was used to that as an environmental scientist. I had been, I dealt with the politics many years before, and that what was fringe has become mainstream, and that's very positive for me. Having been looking at these issues for perhaps 50 years, that makes me optimistic, because it's the first time really we're not simply being regarded. I remember BP director years ago looking at me and saying, if you go on doing this properly, people will take you seriously. Well, it is being taken seriously. That's positive. People are looking at it. And there are changes in the technology which are good. That we during lockdown, in fact a little earlier, we generated all our electricity at one point for one day with renewable resources. I remember lecturing in Worcester a couple of years ago, and there's a lot of technology around Worcester, and I was talking about the importance of batteries, and they said, we're working on it. That's what we do. So I think those things are positive. Negative is that it's moving faster than we thought. If you've noticed, almost all the scientific predictions are too long. Things are happening quicker. And that's because there are positive feedback mechanisms, which are the opposite of homeostasis. As the ice melts, so the land beneath absorbs more heat, because the ice reflected it. It gets absorbed, and that increases temperature, as well as things like the worry about the permafrost, and that beginning to produce carbon dioxide as well. One of the problems with it, why it's become prominent as well, is that until recently, the production of carbon dioxide was exponential. That is, it was doubling every year. So, in a sense, next year produced twice as much as last year, 4 times as much as the year before, and it was rising. In fact, the curve was rising faster than that. Now, hopefully, China is reducing its emissions now. India was still building coal mines, and it's moving away from those fuels without impoverishing people. I think one of the issues we have in the West is that, in a way, we started this. I used to, in my last circuit, live near Coalbrookdale, where the first iron was smelted. That made a huge difference to ordinary people's welfare. Imagine not having cast iron pots and pans unless you were very rich. And cast iron bedsteads made an enormous difference to people's health, particularly women given childbirth. Childbirth fever dropped dramatically, but that produced pollution. Now, we began that, and yet we are saying to people whose life expectancy is lower than ours, whose health is lower than ours, you can't live the way we do, because we want to go on living the way we do, but we don't want the world to suffer the consequences. I think as Christians, we can't do that. It is a danger. A thing called, Celia and I called eco-fascism some years ago, which is, I want to go on living as I am, so you can't change the way you live and use the resources I'm using. I think what we actually have to do is be smart and use technology. I don't think we want to go back to being old at 40. Huge death rates amongst children. If I'm ill, I would like an ambulance and a tarmac road and a hospital with all the technology at the other end. I don't want to go back to the 18th century. And that's the danger, I think, with some of the protests now. We're either saying to other people, you can't do this, or we're saying, we have a right to live in the way we're living now. but you can't change. So they're major issues for the church.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, thanks, Paul. I mean, I think, you know, you've alerted us to, I mean, really the complexity of some of these issues and ethical and political dimensions, let alone theological dimensions. And the church as a whole, of course, is wrestling with some of these issues. I mean, the conference was dealing with issues about, you know, where we invest our money, for instance, and those debates will continue. The scale of the challenge is enormous, and it may even feel impossible for us to do anything. And I wonder if you could break the challenge down a little for us. I mean, what should we or could we be doing at a local church, circuit or district level?
I think one of the things is about influence and the way we live our lives. Actually, the greatest production of greenhouse gases still is domestic heating around the world. That's the biggest thing. After that, it would include big industry because, of course, you're generating power. You know, if you're heating and air conditioning, it is using electricity. That involves industry. And then it's industrial companies that produce so much more than we might domestically. And those are critical. Looking at the way we live, clearly things like using solar panels where we can, insulation is very important. Those are all things that we should do in our own life. But I think the biggest things are actually influence on large companies and countries. And of course, there is a reaction which we've seen in the States. When we produced the report, I remember having two church members, one of whom said, "You won't convince me, I don't care what the evidence is." And another one who said, a very intelligent lady, "I can't possibly believe in climate change because I'm a Christian." And some of those reactions are still there, and you can certainly see them in the debate in the States now. And it's, you know, I don't want to change the way I live. Well, there will be some changes. I think COVID has alerted us to those. I think there are other issues. Climate change is a sort of talisman. One of the things that COVID has alerted us more to is degradation of ecosystems and lack of biodiversity, the destruction of it. There have been several papers in the biological press in the last couple of years alerting us to the dangers of that and predicting something like COVID, because if you change the biological pathways, you're going to produce new ones. And there have been three, COVID is the third of three viruses of its sort, coronaviruses, in the last 10 years. So I think we perhaps shouldn't look at climate change as a single issue. It relates to our ecosystems, to the richness of the diversity of the planet as well.
Thank you, Paul. That's been, I mean, really helpful, and I'm delighted that you're with us in the district. I only wish we could have talked for longer on this subject. I'm sure you may get inquiries from a number of circuits, but thank you, and we look forward to taking these issues forward as a district.
Thank you very much indeed.